election end up with the second female principal chief of the Cherokee Nation. But Wilma Mankeller was also a bit of an icon and did a lot to advance not only the tribe, but the plight of Native women. And so pretty well loved. The U.S. Mint finally released a quarter with their image on it as part of, I think, 5 different releases they're doing this year of special quarters that have different female leaders from around the United States on them. But they did this through Bank First. Good friend of mine, Jay Hanna, was a leader in the tribe during Wilma's administration. He was a treasurer. He's actually at her bedside the day that she died, and is the senior executive vice president of financial services for Bank First. And so he got the chance to oversee that and kind of MC the event. It was great. It was packed, standing room only. There were hundreds of people there. The Mint, U.S. Mint, released $55,000 worth of quarters. They allowed people to buy 2 rolls apiece, and all of the quarters were given out on that day, all the rolls of quarters. So I imagine they'll find their way into circulation as people use them a little bit, because obviously it's a limited release. I'll bring some sometime to show you, but it was a neat event. It was a good opportunity to celebrate something that was, I think, long overdue. All right, we are working our way through Genesis. Today we're in Genesis chapter 17. We get a chance to take a look at some interesting things, a couple of interesting ideas and concepts from that. The scriptures are holy, and before we consider them, we should pray. Let's do that. Gracious and giving God, I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here together, to study together, to learn together, to grow together, and to learn more about who you are and who you're calling us to be. We pray as we work our way through this passage, through this chapter, that your Holy Spirit would fill us, and that in dwelling in us, God, you would begin to open the eyes of our hearts to the way in which you're leading us toward healing individually and as a community. This we ask in your holy name. Amen. Also, just by way of celebration, we've obviously the homeless outreach is still continuing to grow, but many of us are involved in that. So I wanted to share with you that Kathy and Verna were able to find a mattress for Matisse. I think it's Martise. I always say her name wrong. Okay. When she sent it to me, she sent it as M-I-R-T, and I didn't know. I'm like, Martise. Anyway, they found a mattress for her that I believe is getting delivered today. Is that right? And then Larry and I will be taking a couch over to Nikki's apartment this afternoon as well. Larry had one that he was able to find too. So these are people that are a part of our homeless outreach who had been experiencing homelessness and recently got into apartments with absolutely nothing. The day that Nikki walked in, she only had a box. It was probably a week and a half ago that Larry and I were able to bring a bed that Kathy was able to find and donate over to Nikki's apartment. When we walked in, there was absolutely nothing in there. She'd had a cot that the Humpulas had been able to donate to her that I think might be getting passed on. We're going to see if it's still there or not when we get there. But so the community has rallied around our friends and helped them to begin to start rebuilding. But it's neat, really neat thing to experience what it's like for somebody who has not had shelter in a long time to have shelter again and see how they feel about doing that. So keep them in your prayers. We are still looking for furniture. If you come across any, we would love to know about it. Oh, good. Okay. Okay. Okay, good. We'll definitely talk with Verna about that. That's a good resource. The Jackie, who was volunteering out there this week, she connected me with a manager where she works who has a friend who runs a thrift store who wants to donate. And I'm supposed to go out there on Tuesday after the outreach is over to see what they have. So hopefully we'll be able to find some stuff there. That's an exciting thing. The nature of church is changing probably into what it should have been. The pandemic sped a few things up, and some of them are strange. Like last week, we had almost 4,000 people watch this study, and I'm convinced that it was because I was playing the flute. but I turned my microphone off. So I got all these, because I didn't want to like play the flute and have it, go over the microphone here and be so loud. And then I got all these messages that were like, why did you turn your mic off when you're playing? So if you were watching from last week, I'm sorry that you didn't get to hear me play the flute. Maybe you will. Maybe we'll do that again one of these days. But like things have changed a lot. But one of the things that's changed dramatically is that there's a lot more interest and participation in outreach than there was pre-pandemic even, and not just here at our church. That's kind of that's a trend, and I think it's a good trend. I think it's a trend that the church should have been living into before the pandemic, and I'm glad it's living into that trend now. So continue to keep those folks in your prayers. I posted something this week about the Scraper Foundation. I'm gonna say more about that when there's more to release. I'm in the process of creating a website and doing all the filings. For those of us, we're getting ready to have a meeting about filing for a 501c3 for the outreach, the nonprofit that will house the outreach ministries of Southern Hills, which is also becoming a thing. Lazarus is following almost exactly the same model. Bo's doing that there. And other churches, he got the idea elsewhere. So that's something that's becoming much more common as churches live into more of an outreach model than we had lived into before the pandemic. But for those of us who were wondering about that process, what I'm doing with the Scraper Foundation represents the second time I've formed a nonprofit. I did that for the Order of St. Patrick, and I've passed the reins on there. Filed for the nonprofit status this week with the Scraper Foundation, the logo for which I just think is incredibly cool. If you look at it on my Facebook page, you'll see it. It is a flame, and there's a hawk flying into that flame, and that combines. We call Cherokee names sacred names. Megan's sacred name with the sacred name of one of her ancestors that she loves. Those two symbols are combined there, and the reason for that is, while I am filling in the blanks and supporting it, and will certainly be a part of it, this is Megan's dream, and so she came to me and said, "Hey, Dad, can you help me make this a reality? I'm ready to do it." And I said, "Yeah, absolutely." So we talked through for weeks what her vision was, and that evolved into what she decided she wanted to call the Scraper Foundation, which is why the logo on that is related to her name, not mine. Scraper in Cherokee is Disugotsky. We don't normally say our in addition to a family name, we each get a name. Mine is actually tattooed on my back, and we don't normally say them, but at least not in Cherokee. But Megan's name is incorporated into that logo. And so her dream, ever since she started hearing me talk about missing and murdered Indigenous women when she was very young, and I've used those, I use those as examples in sermons about as often as I think I can get away with it. And so ever since she started hearing about that at a young age, it impacted her. Megan is an Indigenous woman. She comes from a family of women. I come from that. My mother is also Indigenous, only sisters and daughters that I have. And so Megan, having grown up in that, developed a pretty strong passion for advocacy. A short version of that is she is now, as of this week when we filed, she is one of the youngest presidents of a nonprofit organization in the United States that has 0 assets as of right now, but we'll change that pretty soon. And her goal is to bring awareness. She'll be starting a podcast. She's taken it upon herself to find the names. She has her own database that she has pulled together the names of missing and murdered Indigenous women who have not been found. Cold cases have become cold and been dropped from all over the U.S. There are actually 41 of those in the state of Oklahoma. She's got a whole list of them. She just did that because she was passionate about it and is now in the process of researching their stories and has gotten offers of help from all over the place for other people who are interested in being a part of that. She'll be starting a podcast where she'll be telling the stories of those women who have not been found, as much as she can possibly do that, because she believes that nobody should be forgotten. And that podcast is going to lead to awareness. Awareness, advocacy, and assistance are her 3 goals. So she'll also be working to advocate for greater resources giving to violence committed against Native women and Two-Spirit people. And then also, the real thrust of what she wants to do, which I think is brilliant, is that she's going to work with private donors, the general public, and tribal governments to create a fund that will provide financial assistance to families whose cases have gone cold so that they can pay for private investigations and also legal fees. And eventually, she wants to be able to employ people to do that through the foundation so that that can come at no cost to families who have exhausted options. Leads have run dry, and they don't want to give up on looking for their family members. So it's a really cool thing. It's her passion. She has a passion to do a couple of other things related to that down the road. But she said, "Dad, would you help?" And I said, "Of course I'm going to help. Why would I not help my kid?" So we're working on putting that together. Once there's a website to launch, we'll put that out on all of our social media as well. And I hope you'll pay attention to it. Megan is passionate about it, and I think she's got a gift for it. She has certainly found her voice. I have no idea where she gets that from. All right, let's talk about Genesis chapter 17. This is often called the reaffirmation of the covenant. So we went through the covenant in Genesis chapter 15, right? And then Genesis chapter 17 is often called a reaffirmation of the covenant. And in many ways it is. However, we've talked about how it is believed that there are three separate sources that come together over time to form the book of Genesis. One of those sources is the Yahwist, called the Yahwist. The other is the Elohist, and then you have the priestly source. And so the first example of the administration of the covenant in Genesis 15 is usually believed to have come at the hand, literally, of the Yahwist writer. And you see that in the way that often that God is referred to. You see a difference in language, whether it's Yahweh or Elohim that is referred to in the writing, right? The writing style also varies, as does kind of the point and the way that the story is told. So most scholars believe that Genesis 15 is written by the Yahwist and Genesis 17 is written by the priestly source. Largely because you see the different ways to refer to God in those two, in the original language there, but also Genesis 17 is concerned with some of the priestly requirements of the covenant, whereas Genesis 15 is kind of just concerned about the nature of the covenant itself and a trust in the providence of Yahweh, which is characteristic of the writing of the Elohist. In chapter 17, where you have the priestly writer, you have a lot of attention given to what is often called the priestly administration of the covenant, which means here are the requirements of the people. The people have to follow this version of religiosity, which in this case is circumcision, right? So there's a lot of energy and effort given to circumcision. That's given rise to a couple of theories, which may or may not be true, but I'll share them with you so you'll know what they are. One of them is that this is a much later addition that Genesis 17 is a much later addition to the story of Genesis to do one of two things, probably both of them. One is to explain the birth eventually of Isaac at such a late age for both Abraham and Sarah, whose names change in this chapter. Another would be to explain the name change, but then also to reinforce from a religious perspective the religiosity that had come to be a part of Abrahamic culture. You need to be circumcised. Well, why do I need to be circumcised? Well, the reason you need to be circumcised is because God says that you have to be circumcised, and if you're not circumcised, then you're cut off from the covenant, which is typical of what we often refer to as a high view of religion. Neither of these two terms is meant to be disparaging, but religiosity is often viewed and talked about as being high or low. High religiosity or high church versus low religiosity or low church would be seen as kind of a difference between formal and heavily focused on rituals and casual and heavily focused on practicality and relationship. Now, like most things, there's probably a good balance between those two views of religiosity and church. But when you have high church is the more high church is, the more it's going to be focused on ritualism. And in the church today, that takes the form typically of liturgy and traditional music, people dressing up, following certain protocols. Low church is going to be the opposite of that. Focus is going to be on usually a celebratory theme as opposed to a more reflective theme. It's going to be casual in nature. It's going to be focused on relationship, both relationship with God and also relationship with one another. And that's usually talked about on both a vertical axis and a horizontal axis, meant to give an impression of the cross. So when you talk about low church, the emphasis is on relationship with God and the person, and the relationship of the community founded together in God. So you've got those two different views of that. The priestly writer, it would be considered to have a high religiosity, because when the priestly writer writes, there's a heavy focus on ritualism, and the religiosity associated with it. You can't be properly religious unless you are properly following the rituals. That's how that writer is going to see things. And if you are, as people, we fall into different categories, and that's an okay thing. If you're more of a high church person, you're going to feel more connected to the liturgy. You'll feel like the liturgy itself is celebratory, though others who don't share that view would probably see it as reflective and somber. You're going to like the fact that people dress a certain way when they come to church and follow certain social protocols while they're at church. If you have a lower church or lower view of religiosity in church, you're going to like being able to probably be yourself, be able to be relational, casual, enjoy being happy and celebrating with a little bit more of an upbeat environment. Probably going to like singing and teaching more so than you like liturgy and singing. And the kind of singing that you like is likely to vary. There are a lot of people who like both types of religious music. There's a reason that we had this religious music culture war in the church throughout the 90s and early 2000s, where some people were adamant about the fact that we needed to sing hymns, and other people were adamant about the fact that we needed to sing praise music. Like many things, over time, there were a bunch of people who said, I really kind of like both of them, I don't mind either one. So like most things, there's a balance. But the priestly writer would fall pretty heavily on the high religiosity side of things, which is why so much time and energy in this chapter is devoted to the idea of circumcision. So we'll talk about that. Because while it is commanded, there is not a good reason given for why it has to be done, other than it has to be done, which is part and parcel of a high religiosity. You do it because you're told to. Low religiosity is going to say, why do I do this? High religiosity is going to say, don't ask those questions, right? And so there's a difference there in those two things. And in this, there's not a reason given as to why the people who adhere to the covenant have to be circumcised. They just do. And if they don't, then they're cut off. Cut off usually meaning one of two things, and scholars aren't really sure which one is meant here. One would be akin to what the church came to call excommunication. If you're not circumcised, you're going to be excommunicated from the group, right? The other would be execution, actually killed. And so scholars aren't really sure which of those two things is meant here when they're talking about being cut off if you're not circumcised. And it's not one of those topics where there's a little debate, and it's probably one thing. They're really not sure. They're not sure really at all if it's excommunication or execution. It could have been either one as far as that goes. So there's a lot to talk about there. There's also a pretty good lesson here that comes in the form of God's silence and the time that has passed. So let's go ahead and dig into this together. Chapter 17. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am El Shaddai. Now, that's, when you're reading, like especially if you're reading a chapter at a time, like if you're one of those, and I'm one of these people, I like read a chapter a day. I'll sometimes not remember everything I read the day before, in the other chapter. Like I'll remember the gist of it. But I won't remember, for instance, that the very last sentence of the former chapter said that Abram was 86 years old. The very last sentence of chapter 16 said that these things happen. Ishmael's born when Abram is 86 years old. The very first sentence of chapter 17 says when Abram was 99 years old. 13 years have passed between the end of chapter 16 and the beginning of chapter 17. And it's then, in his 99th year, 13 years later, that God appears to him, right? Now, God has come, if you follow the chronology, and it could be that there's two writers, it could be that there's a chronology here. I think both of those things can be true. I think there can be two writers, and it also fits into the chronology of the story, so that what happened in 15 happened, what happened in 17 happened, that's part of the chronology, but you've got two different writers contributing to that. That's what I actually think happened. And so because of that, you have, at least 13 years before this, God making a promise that Abraham's descendants are going to be as numerous as the stars in the sky, right? 13 years have gone by And according to the scriptural story, we are at least meant to believe that God has been silent. The promise of the covenant has not come to pass. Abram and Sarai, whose names are about to change, have not had more children in that 13-year period. We're also meant to believe that God is silent. Now, analytical and skeptical as we probably all are, we're probably going to want to say things like, well, I'm sure God spoke to him at some point in that time, but that's us extrapolating. The story is meant for us to believe that God has been silent for those 13 years, and also that in that silence is a silence in fulfilling the covenantal promises made by God. So for 13 years, think about that for a minute, not only is Abram told that he's going to have all these descendants when he's 86 years old, but then another 13 years pass, and God is silent, and it doesn't happen. There is no way that in that time, Abram is not wrestling with a couple of things. One of them is trusting God, that God would do what God said that God would do. It was probably not that hard in the first week, or the second week, or the third month, or maybe even in the second year. But 13 years later, I'm going to trip on that one day. He's 99 years old, right? He's almost 100. Nothing has happened yet, and God has been silent. This God that sought him out several times, told him to do all these things, is silent. And so Abram's got to be also, in addition to struggling with trusting God, he's also got to be struggling with God's silence over that very long period of time. One of the reasons I think that's important is because as followers of Christ, as people who are in relationship with God, we'll go through periods where God is silent. One of the lessons we get out of the story of Abram, the story of who is now Abraham, is that when God speaks, it is the right thing to do and it's the right time. And when God is silent, it is also the right thing to do and it is the right amount of time. But we struggle a lot with one more so than we struggle with the other. We don't struggle so much with when God speaks. We struggle with when God is silent. And in this case, God is silent for 13 years, where nothing that has been promised has yet come to pass, at least not with regard to the covenantal promise of descendants. So there's no way that Abraham is not struggling with this, and then God shows up again. What does that mean for us? Part of the story here says, again, just like Hebrews reiterates, God will do what God has said that God will do. For us, reading the story, 13 years passes in the span of the white space between the end of chapter 16 and the beginning of chapter 17. It's almost like how someone's life ends up being encapsulated by the dash between two dates on a headstone. That takes up a lot more time than that dash looks like it accounts for. That white space included 13 years of struggling, questioning, wrestling, waiting, wondering if he got it wrong, wondering if he didn't hear what he thought he heard, wondering if he didn't interpret what he thought he was supposed to interpret. And this is from a God who, according to the scriptural story, is literally showing up and walking next to Abraham, talking with Abraham, and giving Abraham what we call direct revelation, right? So this is not like Abram is wondering if it was God that he talked to. So he's wondering, A, is God going to do this? And B, why is God being silent this whole time? If God said that, because I'm getting older, I'm not going to live forever, so why is God silent the whole time? And then God shows up again. What does that mean for us? If God, now I firmly believe that every single human is as important to God and is as loved by God as every other human who's ever lived and ever will live and is living now. Most of us will not have stories that make it into Holy Scripture. Most of us won't. If God is going to be silent for 13 years in the life of Abraham, then God is also probably going to be silent in your life and in mine for a period of time. And that period of time may be, probably likely will be, longer than we're comfortable with. To the point that we'll wonder if God is going to do what God has promised. To the point that we'll wonder why God is being silent. Standard response to that is to first question, God, why are you being silent? Then to get upset. To get upset in the sense of trying to defend the fact that I haven't done anything to warrant that silence, which turns into being upset with God. Because if I haven't done anything to warrant that silence, then God, why are you being silent? Now it's your fault. And that anger usually leads to resignation. At least as we're growing and spiritually maturing, that anger will lead to a resignation that's not a negative resignation, but more of a holy resignation. God, if this is it, so be it. I will wait and rest, knowing that you are God, and that when you come back, it'll be the right time. When you speak again, it'll be the right time. And that there's also probably a reason for your silence right now. So I'm going to sit in that silence, rest in it, and see if I can, together with you, begin to understand the reason for that silence. Because, and I did just say together with you, God's silence does not mean that God is not present. One of the ways that we grow is to learn to rest in the presence of God, even when the dialogue, the communication, or the silence of God is a part of that presence, right? All right, so 99 years old, 13 years. The other thing that this is meant to teach us, in addition to if God's going to be silent for 13 years in Abraham's life, God's going to be silent in your life and in mine too. And that's the right thing. If God is silent, God's silence is right. And God's silence, when you go through that time, God's silence is not a punishment. When God is being silent, God is not being silent to punish. There is a difference between God being silent, and this is important, because that's what's happening here. God is being silent. There's a difference between God being silent and me not wanting to listen to God. Those are two different things. And that's a question to wrestle with. Is God being silent, or am I just not listening? And am I not listening because I'm not paying attention? Am I not listening because I don't want to listen? And as we work our way through that, you may very well find that you are listening, you are seeking, and God is being silent, right? There's a difference between those two things. So in addition to the lesson that if God is going to be silent for 13 years in the life of Abraham, God is also going to be silent in my life at times, and when God is silent, it's right. God will come back in God's timing, which is also right, good, and holy. But that's the other lesson, that God will be back. And I don't mean back in the sense that God's presence has left. I mean, God's going to start talking again. God's going to start communicating again when the time for that to happen is the right time for it to happen, which is what happens here. After 13 years, God comes back to talk again. Abram is 99 years old. If you are going through a period of silence, then my advice to you is this. Spend a little bit of time in prayer, because the silence of God does not mean that God's presence is not with you. Rest in God's presence, and in that presence, begin to discern whether God is being silent or you are not listening. And as you work your way through that, if the issue is that you're not listening, or by not listening, let me say, not paying attention, then start paying attention. The answer there, people will often hear something like that and immediately go, well, Pastor, it's not that simple. It is. Start paying attention. It really is. It's about that simple. Start listening, start paying attention. Because in those instances, there's a good chance that God is already communicating. You know what God is communicating, and you're not wanting to have anything to do with it, right? Which means that it is as simple as, okay, I am going to pay attention to this and see what you're trying to tell me. However it is that God is communicating. But if you work through that, and you are paying attention, and you're really not aware of anything that, you're trying to not miss anything. God is not sitting up on God's throne laughing at you, sending information in code, and thinking it's funny when you can't decipher that code, right? God's not doing that. So when you come through that, and if you realize that you are paying attention, and you're not aware of something that you're missing. God's not trying to hide things from you. You're not aware of something that you're missing. There's not something God has been trying to communicate that you just don't really want to have anything to do with. For whatever the reason, it's going to cause you to change what you think or believe or do or get out of your comfort zone or whatever it is. If that's not what's going on, then God is being silent. So wait. Sit in the silence. Continue to do what you know to do. Don't fall into the trap of believing that you've done something wrong, because if God is silent, then God's silence in that moment is holy. Let the holiness of God's silence fill your spirit and heal whatever that silence is needing to heal. 13 years later, when Abram is 99, God speaks again and says something that you've heard in music. It actually occurs 48 times throughout the Bible. The reference to God as El Shaddai occurs 48 times in the Scriptures. You probably, it's in the book of Job more than it is anywhere else, but it's 48 times total. And you probably are more familiar with it from the Amy Grant song, El Shaddai, that made its way into a lot of our worship music for a while. El Shaddai means a couple of things. It actually most literally translates to um, God of the mountain plain that evolves into the steppes and eventually into a mountain. That's what the word means. El Shaddai means that. And it's meant to give the image of God of the mountain. God is as stable and powerful and enduring as a mountain. But it often gets, that translation gets reduced to God of power because it's easier to say than all of those other things. So often El Shaddai will be translated as God of power. In actuality, it's probably better seen as God of the mountain. But so much of the Hebrew language is visual. It's very, very visual, depictive, descriptive language. The Lord appeared to Abram, this is verse 1, and said to him, I am El Shaddai. Walk with me. It's interesting, right? We just experienced Hagar naming God El Roi, the one, you are the one who listens. And that's unprecedented. Here, God is coming and saying, this is who I am. I am the God of power. I am the God who is as enduring, as present, as immovable, as powerful, as reliable as the mountain. Why would God approach Abram? And that's the first thing that he says. Maybe because God has been silent for 13 years and Abram has been questioning. And those questions have made their way to God, right? I am El Shaddai. I'm the God who is as immovable as the mountain. I will do what I have said that I will do, but I'll do it when the time is right. Walk with me and be trustworthy. I will make covenant between us. So he goes immediately into this, right? 13 years has gone by, and he goes in to reaffirm the covenant, because this is what Abram's been struggling with. God knows that, right? Now it's time for something to happen. I'll make a covenant between us, and I will give you many, many descendants. Abram knows this. Abram fell on his face, and God said to him, but me, my covenant is with you. You will be the ancestor of many nations. So Abram fell on his face, and God said to him, but me? This is a personal thing. He said, I'm going to make you, I'm making a covenant between us, and that covenant's going to involve descendants, but my covenant is with you. I'm going to do this to you, with you, for you. You will be the ancestor of many nations. That's a personal statement, and it's a personal statement of commitment in the context of friendship. Essentially what God is saying is, I am your friend. You are my friend. I'm doing this, we're doing this together. Yes, I'm making a covenant that will span generations, but it's with you. You are my friend. And because I have made you the ancestor of many nations, verse 5, your name will no longer be Abram, but Abraham. Abraham means, people will say father of many nations. It actually means ancestor of a lot of people. It's literally translated to ancestor of a lot of people. That's a whole other thing. There's a lot of patriarchal references in the Bible that aren't accurate translations. So in this case, it's not father of many nations, it's ancestor of a multitude is actually what it translates to. So there's a strong history of name changing in almost every tribal culture, including the Celtic and Germanic tribes of Western Europe and the British Isles. Name changing is a thing, right? I was talking with some people recently in a Cherokee history group that we were part of, and we're talking about the name changes that have been common for us. The Ridge, there was a man named the Ridge who was responsible for being one of the treaty signers that fraudulently sold our land to the U.S. government, caused a Trail of Tears to happen. He ended up changing his name to Major Ridge to reflect his military service. My 3 times great-grandfather, who is the Scrapers, where my name comes from, when he was a child, he was called Squirrel, Salawi in Cherokee. He was called the Squirrel, presumably because he must have flitted around, right? A lot of our names are that way, and we'll often have a different name when we're young than when we get older. His name changed later because he went to battle, interestingly enough, with Major Ridge in the Creek War and earned the name of Six Killer, which is obvious to figure out, right? He was a part of this raid across a river, killed 6 people. They started calling him Six Killer after that, and so he went by it. Instead of being called Squirrel, he started going by Six Killer. Well then, somebody, a European, what is the word I'm looking for? Retinue, saw him scraping did you catch that? Scraping a warrior. It's one of our practices. I've told you some of this before. Use a notched wolf bone, scrape along the arms and the chest and the back and the legs as part of a ritual that we had before we went to war. And so they started calling him, they started referring to him as the Scraper and later as Old Man Scraper, and so he took that name. There's so many examples of that, not just in indigenous American culture, but also in Arabic culture, where after a time, for a reason, your name is going to change. There's two ways that that commonly happens in most cultures. One is that you take on another name and tell everybody that this is now my name to reflect something, but most commonly that name is given you, right? And you can reject it. I keep trying to reject this name because I have a name, and I keep trying to reject the name I was given because I went to this cornstalk shoot once. Have I told you this story? I'm going to tell you the story. I went to this cornstalk shoot. Do you know what that is? So traditional games, we do hatchet throwing and all kinds of stuff. I'm actually pretty good at hatchet throwing. We'll take a cut-off portion of a log and put it on an easel and put a little card on it, stand away, flip the hatchet at least once, and if you hit the card, you get a point. Way better at that than I thought I was going to be. Dad's not good at it at all. But we also do this thing called cornstalk shoots, right? Which is where you're out on a football field, and they take a couple of stakes, 4 stakes, and they put dried corn stalks stacked between them about this high. They're going to be about this wide, about this high, right? And they're at each end of the football field. You take an arrow and replace the tip with like a lawn dart tip, you know, like a really long tip, and you stand at one end of the football field and shoot all the way across the football field and try to get the lawn dart to go into the corn stalks, called a cornstalk shoot, right? So we'd stand back. I'd never done this before, and I'm standing at one end of this field. And I was a sniper. And it does not matter that I was not a sniper with a bow and arrow. That's still going to come up every time I do something like this, right? And so everybody's joking about it and like, it's funny, Matt's a sniper. I've never done this before. So I pull back and shoot, and I go like 50 yards. And I'm like, I need to aim higher. So I pull back, aim higher, takes off. I don't even know where that goes. Obviously, it went too far, and I'm like, I'm just going to split the distance, right? So I split the distance, let go, pierced 7 corn stalks. This is my third, I know, it's the only time I've ever done it too. So pierced 7 corn stalks. I'm so excited, right? And so everybody else is shooting. I'm the only one who pierces the corn stalks. I finally put all of the stupid sniper jokes to rest, because it's my first time doing this, and I hit the corn stalks. We need to go find my other arrow. We can't find it anywhere. And we're looking around. There's a guy out there whose family was connected to ours for a pretty long time. And he just starts laughing. And we all look at him, and he points up to the scoreboard where my arrow is sticking out of the scoreboard. And he's like, we're going to start calling you Sign Killer from now on. Your name is now Sign Killer. I'm like, no, it's not. He's like, yeah, no, it is. That's going to be your name. So he calls me that, and he's the only person that I let get away with it. Sometimes in all of those cultures, most cultures throughout the world, particularly tribal cultures, name changes have been a common thing. It's only been in a more modern era, more recent era, where changing our names regularly has not been a thing. Neither is anymore naming to reflect something. You probably looked up has everybody looked up what your name meaning is? What your name means, your first name? A lot of us have, right? I looked up what Matthew meant a long time ago just because I wanted to know what it meant. Often we don't name anymore to reflect something. We name because we like the name or it's trendy. But that's recent. For most of human history, it was common to name according to a particular trait you were trying to impose on somebody or to reflect something. And that's what's happening here. Abram's name, and Sarai's name is going to change too, is changing from Abram to Abraham. Abraham, which means ancestor of a multitude. Abram simply means exalted ancestor. So Abram is exalted ancestor. Abraham is ancestor of a multitude. Right? So God is changing his name. And in this culture, like many others, a name was always believed to have a certain amount of power to bring about what the name said. And so for the people in this culture, for Abraham to be named and to be named by God is a big deal, right? It's not only an honor, but it's an indication that God is going to do what God has said that God will do. I'll make you very fertile. I will produce nations from you. Kings will come from you. I'll set up my covenant with you and your descendants after you in every generation, and enduring covenant. So he's reaffirming the covenant. I will be your God and your descendants' God after you. I will give you and your descendants the land in which you are immigrants, which is the whole land of Canaan, as an enduring possession. We've already learned that the Canaanites are not favored, right? And I will be their God. God said to Abraham, which is his name now, as for you, you must keep my covenant, you and your descendants in every generation. This is my covenant that you and your descendants must keep. This is going to be fleshed out really well in Deuteronomy. But this is the sign of it. You must circumcise every male. You must circumcise the flesh of your foreskins, and it will be a symbol of the covenant between us. No reason as to why. Hence the nature of a high religiosity coming from the priestly writer. You just have to do it, and you obey. High religiosity says obey without question, right? Circumcise every male. You must circumcise the flesh of your foreskins. It will be a symbol of the covenant. Verse 12, on the 8th day after birth, so that's when you do it, every male in every generation must be circumcised, including those who are not your own children. So this is not just an ethnic thing. This is anybody who comes to be a part of your community needs to bear the sign of this covenant. Those born in your household and those purchased with silver from foreigners. Now, when is the child supposed to be circumcised? On the 8th day. This theology is the origination of the theology of infant baptism, which is the oldest practice of the church. We read a passage this last week or the week before on Sunday that talked about somebody having their entire household baptized. That includes the slaves, the children. In fact, it was a pretty well-known practice that infants were baptized regularly up until the Protestant Reformation in and around the 1500s, when believers' baptism started to be a thing. People started saying, oh no, you shouldn't do that, right? You should make people choose first. And as is the case 500-600 years later, everybody's like, oh no, that's the way it's always been done. It's always been, no it hasn't. Infants have always been baptized. And that theology originates here with the sign of the covenant, for which Christians, that sign is baptism. Baptism is the sign of the covenant. So just as here, God is saying that the sign of the covenant, interestingly, the idea that you would make a choice does not enter into this at all. God is not saying, wait until the child comes of age and let the child decide if the child wants to be a part of the covenant community. In this case, the child is born into the covenant community and bears the symbol of the covenant community as a part of that. Same idea has always been true for baptism. We'll talk in depth about infant baptism at some point, but the idea that a child would choose that is a pretty recent addition to Christian doctrine. All right, let's move on. On the 8th day, so every male is in every generation must be circumcised. Those born in your household, those purchased with silver from foreigners. 13, be sure you circumcise those born in your household and those purchased with your silver. So that's reiterated. Your flesh will embody my covenant as an enduring covenant. Any uncircumcised male whose flesh of his foreskin remains uncircumcised will be cut off from his people. And a good example of the patriarchal nature of this culture rests in the fact that there is a sign of the covenant for males and not one for females. Women do not have anything imposed upon them as a part of the sign of the covenant, right? Largely because of the way that women are viewed and treated in this patriarchal culture. The foreskin remains uncircumcised. He'll be cut off from his people. We've talked about that. Scholars don't know if that means excommunication or execution. Could have meant either one. He has broken my covenant. So by not being circumcised, that results in the breaking of the covenant. There's no explanation as to why. Why is it that this physical symbol is something that has to be done, and if it's not done, you're either going to be excommunicated or executed because you've broken the covenant? In what way was the covenant broken? By not bearing the sign of the covenant, and why is this the sign of the covenant? There's a lot of evidence from antiquity that circumcision does not begin here. It's a widely practiced thing throughout Egypt and Ammon and all kinds of places, right? Pretty well recorded. There are instances in which circumcision is a sign of marriage, that you're giving yourself to another in marriage. And so there are more than a few scholars who've said, well, that's the thing. You know, the covenant means you're married to God, which could be a good explanation, but it's also not an explanation that comes from the text. There's just not one given here. God said to Abraham, as for your wife. Now, he doesn't say this to Sarai. Did you catch that? He says this to Abraham about Sarai. God said to Abraham, as for your wife, Sarai, you will no longer call her Sarai. Her name will now be Sarah. I will bless her and even give you a son from her. I will bless her so that she will become nations, and kings of peoples will come from her. She's going to be blessed as well. Abraham fell on his face. He goes prostrate. Fell on his face and laughed. He said to him, can a 100-year-old man become a father, and Sarah, a 90-year-old woman, have a child? To God, Abraham said, if only you would accept, to God, Abraham said, if only you would accept Ishmael. God's going to be like, no, your descendancy is going to come from a different line. God said, no, your wife Sarah will give birth to a son for you, and you will name him Isaac. I will set up my covenant with him and his descendants after him as an enduring covenant. As for Ishmael, I've heard your request. I will bless him and make him fertile and give him many, many descendants. He will be the ancestor of 12 tribal leaders, and I will make a great nation from him. But I will set up my covenant with Isaac, who will be born to Sarah at this time next year. When God finished speaking to him, God descended, leaving Abraham alone. Abraham took his son, Ishmael, all those born in his household, and all those purchased with silver, that is, every male in Abraham's household, and he circumcised the flesh of their foreskins that same day, just as God had told him to. Abraham was 99 years old when he circumcised the flesh of his foreskin, and his son Ishmael was 13 years old when the flesh of his foreskin was circumcised. Anecdotally, that just seems awful. The same day, Abraham and his son Ishmael were circumcised. All the men of his household, those born in his household, and those purchased with silver from foreigners were circumcised with him. That's, again, repeated like 2 or 3 times. Like we have seen before, God tells Abraham to do something, then we are told how Abraham lives out the command that God has given him, and he does it. One of the lessons that comes from the story of Abraham is that Abraham responds in obedience. Abraham does not always respond without questioning God. Questioning God is okay to do, but Abraham always obeys. So over and over again, God will command, God will promise. Abraham will live out the command and live out the promise, and we're given an example of how Abraham does that. Abraham circumcised every single male in the household, all of them. All of them were done on the same day, which is a way of saying all of them were circumcised without delay. In the next chapter, which we'll hit next week, we're going to go into the birth of Isaac, and then we'll also end up moving into the story of Sodom as we kind of we're moving toward the promise given to Isaac, or given to Abraham through the birth of Isaac, and then this oddly difficult to understand story about why God would command Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, which is coming in just a few chapters. All right, we have just a few minutes. Do you have any questions or thoughts before we close our time together? Yeah. So the question, if you're watching, is when Abraham laughs and he's like, how can a 100-year-old man become a father when he just had a kid at the age of 86? Because a lot of us would be like, haha, how can an 86-year-old man become a father? Fun fact, that happened in my own family. Arch Scraper was 85 years old when he married his last wife. 4 of his wives died, 3 of them in childbirth. Married Mary, her name was Mary, when she was 15. He was 85 years old and had 2 children after that. I don't think that's meant to validate the scriptural idea of having kids at 86, but most of us would say, how can you have a kid at that age? That's not normal, not common, not commonly done. I think in terms of Abraham, this is my take on it because I haven't read anything, so this is just me extrapolating. But I think what's happened here is that what you're seeing there is less Abraham being rational, like if I had a kid at 86, I can probably have a kid now, and more the fact that God has been silent for 13 years. And I think what you're getting in that is Abraham's frustration, is communicating his frustration with God's silence. We could have done this before now, and yet now I'm even older than I was then, and I'm supposed to do this. That's how I've always read it. In my own head, as I process that, or as I have processed that, I think that what you're getting there is this very natural freedom to have a real relationship with God, such that even though Abraham obeys God every time God tells him to do something, he does it, he still gets frustrated with God, which is, in my mind, a good example of the kind of friendship that God offers with God's creation. God expects a friendship. God expects frustration. God gets frustrated as well. We've seen it. We'll see it again. So that's how I've always interpreted that, if that helps. Other questions, thoughts? Yeah. Are you speaking about that in the context of, just so I understand, the delay in the birth of Isaac for Ishmael to age? Okay, yeah. So the comment was that there's a, if I'm hearing it right, there's a purpose. There's a delay between the birth of Ishmael, and that's true, and the birth of Isaac. And Ishmael would have been considered a man by the time Isaac is born. And so if I'm hearing you correctly, what I hear you saying is God has a purpose in that. There's a purpose in the delay between the birth of Ishmael and the birth of Isaac. I would agree with that. I think God is absolutely doing what God promised, but I also think there's a reason for the birth of Isaac when Isaac is born. Do we get that reason? No, we don't get the reason, but I think there is one. I've thought about this some over the years, and again, this is not a scholarly thing, this is just a Matt thing, but I've thought about that some over the years and thought, well, what if there are other reasons, sociocultural reasons, communal reasons, I don't know, geography-related reasons that Isaac needed to be born when Isaac was born so that Isaac would live to a certain time? I don't know. I've wondered that. It could be, and in my brain, when I think through something like that, I kind of go, it could be something as simple as that. Maybe this is just the time span that Isaac needed to be alive, and so God waits until that happens. But then that leads to a whole other question, which Christians have struggled with for eons, which is, why doesn't God just tell Abraham what is to come? Why doesn't God, instead of being silent for 13 years and waiting until Abraham is nearly 100 years old, why doesn't God just say, you're going to be the ancestor to many nations. You're going to have descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. And by the way, you're going to have Isaac when you're around the age of, 100 years old. And then Abraham would go, like, okay, we're going to have Isaac when I'm 100 years old, Can you say that again? Okay, so the question is, did God not say this? Did God not give the information to Abraham because God is testing Abraham to see if he's going to be faithful? And people say God doesn't test you. There's scriptural examples of that. Like the Bible says that, right? And so I never understand why people want to say that. Do I think that's happening here? Quite possibly. I think that you could be seeing, and in fact, that's a lot of the theology behind the sacrifice of Isaac. That same idea. Could be that. Could be that, it is a simple truth. I preached to you all about this before on a Sunday morning. There's a simple truth that sometimes when we know too much, we mess up everything. We mess everything up. I can look back at the moments in my life when I was frustrated that I didn't have more information from the Spirit about a period of waiting or what was coming, or I felt like the Spirit was leading me to do something only to not understand why I'm being led to do this or how long it's going to take or what I'm supposed to do to make it happen. And then time will go by, God will be at work, I will do the things as best I can, I'm going to be obedient as best I can, mostly, not always. And then I'll look back on that after a period of time and realize that if I had known then what I know now, I would have messed it all up. I would have done something too fast. I'd have put too much effort into something. Thinking I knew what was to come, I would have tried to manipulate the circumstances around me to make that happen and would have failed. Oftentimes when I look at that, I'll see how the Spirit led me to be at work in the circumstances that surround whatever God is leading me to do in a way that it actually worked out. I wouldn't have worked it out, and I can say that with confidence. So it could be that too. The Christians have struggled with this. When God is silent, why is God silent? Why don't you just tell me the things I want to know, and then I can feel better about things? Sometimes God does. The lesson, though, I think that we're supposed to get is that if God doesn't answer all of our questions, God is doing that because it's the best choice. And so the question really comes down to, do you trust that what God does is I could say this a lot of ways, best, most loving, kindest, most caring, most appropriate, most correct thing that God could do, even if you're the one in the dark? God will do what God has said that God will do. And that, I'll come right to you, that is part and parcel of Abraham's story. Abraham chooses to trust. He gets frustrated, but he chooses to trust. And God works out God's purposes. There's a lesson there for you and me. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And so for those who are watching, the statement there was aptly, look at how often we read the scriptures and we don't get all the details, we don't get all the information. But God makes a promise, and essentially, we are actually taught and called to trust in that promise. But each and every one of us has probably found that it is a lot easier to hear the lesson than it is to implement the lesson, right? When it's in my life that I'm supposed to trust. God, why aren't you doing something? God, why aren't you talking? God, why have you been silent for 13 years? Where are you in the midst of all this? Christians have cried that out. The Psalms are chock full of, Psalms of Lament are chock full of people crying out, God, where are you? God, where are you? God, where are you? Right? And yet in the midst of all of that, more often than not in the scriptures, the answer to that question is trust. And if you pay attention to the story of Abraham, also obey, just like the hymn says. Trust and obey. But for us, the question is, do you? Do I? Do I trust God? Do I trust God to have my best interests at heart? Do I trust God to have the best interests of creation at heart? Do I trust God to use me in a way that is good for all creation, and that God will do what God has said that God will do, and that there will be a time when I don't have to worry about the suffering of humanity anymore because I'll be in a place where that's not a thing? Do I trust all those things? And if I trust them, can I trust them even when I am not the one in charge, which is where the entire theology of the lordship of Christ comes from? Am I going to give my fealty to Christ as Lord, which means that I let God be in charge and I don't make all the decisions? But then we're like, well, I have to make some decisions, right? So I need to know everything I need to know in order to make decisions. There is not a one of us, and people find this in other capacities because it works this way in many jobs, but there is not one person who served in the military who does not know what it is like to follow commander's intent without all the information, right? Because you end up having to make decisions in the field based upon the intent of the commander given to you through what is called an operations order. You've got to do the best that you can when circumstances change and you have to make decisions on the fly, and you're trying to do that all in line with your best understanding of the commander's intent. Is all of this, does it line up perfectly with a military analogy? No, but the same concept applies. When I'm living out the calling that God has placed on my life and on my heart, and God is silent, I do what I know to do as best I can and trust that God is being silent because God's silence is the best thing that could happen right then. And with that, I need to go ahead and draw us to a close, so let me pray for you. Gracious and giving God, we're grateful for your guidance, and we're also grateful for your silence. We know in our heads that when you are silent, your silence is the best thing. And not only for us, but for creation, as you're working out your purposes in us. But we don't always know that with our hearts. And so, as we can conceive of the fact that that can be a good thing, help us to also be able to internalize that and trust where our ability to control falls short. This we ask in your name. Amen. Thank you, my friends, for being here.